Hello, I'm Sarah Agnew, your keynote speaker for this online festival gathering. This is not how I was expecting to speak with you. For the past 2.5 years, I've been visualising us gathered together in Dayton, Ohio, in that big room there, all together in one space. Instead, here I am on the other side of the world, in Canberra, Australia, which is Ngunnawal land, and I pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the land from which I speak to you today. And there you are, in many and varied places, home to many and varied peoples. As I compose these sessions and record them, I can't even imagine whether you'll be in your own homes or able to gather together in small groups. It's so uncertain and so different wherever we are. But certainly we are in multiple countries, because I know I've met people from the Philippines, the UK, Canada, India, all over the USA, South Korea, parts of South America, and other parts of Australia when I've gathered in Asheville, Washington DC or Dayton for festival gatherings. But I haven't met all of you, of course. So in case you haven't read The Biblical Storyteller recently, let me introduce myself. I am a storyteller, poet, minister. I'm an ordained minister of the word in the Uniting Church in Australia, which is a Protestant movement with roots in Presbyterian, Methodist and Congregational churches. And I serve with the Wesley Uniting Congregation in Canberra. And I'm a member of the Network of Biblical Storytellers Scholar Seminar. My poetry and liturgy can be found in various places, online or in publications, and I compose and tell original stories as well as telling biblical stories. And you can discover more at sarahagnew.com.au. I spent 3 years before coming to Canberra in Scotland doing a Ph.D. at the University of Edinburgh. My thesis develops a new method for interpreting the Bible out of my practice as a biblical storyteller. And it's that work that will underpin what I will talk with you about in these 3 sessions. The method that I introduced in my thesis and in the forthcoming book, Embodied Performance, Mutuality, Embrace and the Letter to Rome, is embodied performance analysis. I'm going to spend this first session exploring in particular the tools of that method. And I'm going to help you, when we do that, to reflect on your own practice as biblical storytellers and how what you're doing when you're inhabiting the stories, internalizing them and telling them is not just communication, but it is in itself interpretation. It is making meaning of the Bible. Often we're led to believe that biblical interpretation is carried out by a cognitive mind detached from physical, emotional, and our relational aspects of our being. But I hope that as we remind ourselves of our holistic meaning-making processes as human beings, you'll find embodied performance analysis and its tools helpful for developing your practice as tellers, as performers, as interpreters. So we'll begin with embodied performance analysis, which is a rigorous interpretation of the Bible by holistic means. And that'll underpin sessions 2 and 3, where we're going to open out into our broader embodied performance with lowercase letters, or our lived enactment of God's story, biblical and beyond. And we'll look at that in the contexts of our worship and devotional lives and in the telling of our own personal stories. In the materials, you'll find a guide to applying this method as a Bible reader or a biblical storyteller. You'll also find in the materials that are online for registered participants of the gathering, copies of the slides that you're seeing now, and some of the references that I mention as I'm speaking to you. So this is the technical introduction to embodied performance analysis. Essentially, embodied performance analysis employs tools of the body, emotion, and audience, integrated with a range of other interpretive approaches to discern meaning in a biblical composition. It consists of two parts, a performance interpretation and a critical reflection. The performance interpretation is what we often call in the network a telling or a performance. It could be live or digital. It could be an independent telling or an ensemble telling. And the critical reflection basically takes you behind the scenes of your preparation, talks about the impact on you as you're rehearsing, and the possible decisions you could make and what you actually did decide to do for the performance and how that shows you meaning in the text. Process involves preparation and performance and reflection, which is roughly linear, but it often cycles through each of those steps several times before you arrive at a more definitive performance interpretation and final critical reflection. I demonstrated the approach in the thesis and in the book with the letter to the Rome, and I'm going to share some examples of that as we go along before I do a full sort of example of a performance analysis. A key feature of this embodied and performed approach to interpretation is that it embraces the personal and particular nature of any engagement with the Bible. Anytime we engage with the Bible, we are interpreting it. We're making meaning in and of and through it. And every time we do that, it is personal. It's shaped by the story and experience of the interpreter. And it is particular. It's shaped by the time and the culture and the context of the interpreter and their audience. It's also an approach that is intentionally immersive and intuitive, because it takes seriously that we are physical and emotional and relational in our whole being, and that through our wholeness of being we develop a deep knowledge through our immersion in our environment or our immersion in the story, and that shapes our intuitive responses to the world or the world of the story we inhabit. So it's important to attend to our responses and the way that they are actually showing us meaning. The method or the process, as I mentioned a little minute ago, is in 3 steps. Firstly, preparation. This is when you would undertake a translation or adapt the translation, lay out the script, and rehearse. And you might include in this preparation stage some preliminary performances. Then you move into the performance, the main performance or series of performances for an audience. And in step 3, we reflect. We go behind the scenes, as I said, integrating our insights from the preparation and the performance, and the way that we've explored the questions that arise there using scholarship or other interpretive methods, and we put it into a coherent discussion of the composition in performance. Now, it might be that you go through, as I said, those steps several times, implementing insights from reflection in your adaptation or changing translation or rehearsing again before arriving at a more definitive performance and analysis. Now the tools. Now this is where we're going to spend most of our time in this session. The tools are the filters through which we hear the meaning in the composition. So our first tool that I talk about is the body. And we're looking at how the body moves in response to the composition. So your intuitive, instinctive gestures, movements, postures. And also incorporated in that is your voice. What are you doing with your voice? The second tool is emotion, and that's paying attention to how the performer-interpreter feels in response to the composition, and what's the impact it's having on your emotions, and discerning what that's telling you about yourself or the composition. And the third tool is the audience. And as a tool, we're thinking about how the performer-interpreter listens to your audience, envisaging your audience in preparation and anticipating as best you can how the audience might meaningfully receive this composition today. So you're holding them in mind through your whole preparation, and you've got them in your live performances in preparation and your main performance. So, as I said, I'm going to focus on these tools in this session, and use that as an invitation for you to reflect on your practice as biblical storytellers, and how, when you inhabit and mediate the biblical composition for an audience, you are interpreting that composition. Embodied performance analysis is about observing the impact of the Bible on you and your audience, and then investigating the questions that arise with appropriate methods, which might be narrative, rhetorical, liberation, any of the established biblical interpretation methods. And that might be you go through those processes yourself. You know, with narrative, you might explore character or setting or plot. It might be that you go back and engage with some of the scholarship, taking different approaches. So we're observing the impact of the Bible on us as we internalize it, and we're discerning meaning from our instinctive interpretations in conversation with our reflective and objective interpretations. We're not replacing the more objective, sometimes called rational, way of interpreting the Bible. We're enhancing it by bringing the fullness of our being into the process. So let's delve a bit deeper into those tools. And we'll start with the body. Phenomenologist Maurice Merleau-Ponty observed that one's body is the fabric into which all objects are woven, and it is, at least in relation to the perceived world, the general instrument of our comprehension. Our body is the means by which we make meaning. Merleau-Ponty suggested that the full explanation of our knowledge of self arises from participating and interacting with our embodied existence. Our sensory motor functions have been shown to be not just information gathering processes. Physically, it seems, humans understand what we perceive through our senses and our movement, and we're already poised to respond as the cognitive process continues to interpret that knowledge, which is knowledge, not simply raw data, for the cognitive mind to do interpretation. So it's from this position that I employ the body as a tool for interpretation, taking seriously that we know things and we understand things within our physical body. In an aged care facility, the chaplain leads a group of residents in worship. Many of these folk would have trouble recognising her, even though they see her here every week and around the complex all the time. Many have difficulty recognising their spouses or their children or their grandchildren. Today they're going to celebrate Holy Communion. The chaplain begins with words of greeting. The Lord be with you. And without having the words to read before them, each of the residents reply, and also with you. Lift up your hearts. We lift them to the Lord. Let us give thanks to the Lord our God. It is right to give our thanks and praise. Now, while you're surprised that I know the words from your tradition or something similar, many of us share roughly the same words for this part of our communion liturgy. What I want to draw your attention to is the embodied memory of these residents. More evident in a pianist with dementia who can play the songs they learnt in younger days, perhaps. The principle is the same. Some things we know because our body knows them. And that can include our fingers on the piano or our voices speaking a shared liturgy. The body knows. It also interprets, it makes meaning, it is doing so all the time. One of the examples I used in the thesis was from the armed forces. Soldiers will often talk about how they know and they discerned meaning or interpreted the context in which they were perhaps fighting or fighting simulated battles intuitively. They weren't thinking at the time, they just reflexively, intuitively, instinctively knew there was someone around that corner because they could read the signs with their bodies. So we're doing it all the time. And that means that we're doing that when we encounter and engage with the Bible, but we rarely speak of, or let alone attend to it for ourselves, this response of our bodies as showing us meaning, as doing work of interpretation. Now, when I tell the story of Jesus welcoming children, for example, you've had the disciples turning the children away, and Jesus says, no, let the children come. Let the children come. And unless you come like a child, you're not entering the kingdom. Now, at this point, I'm picking up the child. As I myself have caught in my arms children in my congregation and my family, you know, like the 3 or 4-year-old who runs towards you and you pick them up. And here comes emotion too, because emotion is embodied. Jesus feels delight in the child. And I feel delight. I feel his delight in my body, in my emotions, and I know, I understand what he means when he says, this is how you enter the kingdom of God. He means we're caught by God who delights in us. We're held in an embrace of love. He means we are to be as trusting and vulnerable as that child, giving themselves into those arms. Now, one might arrive at that interpretation by narrative or socio-historical analysis. But performer and audience understand the meaning through the physical mediation of the story by the performer interpreter. And when we know in our bodies, we understand in a deeper way than word-based cognitive thought. Whitney Shiner told us what the ancient orators knew. We believe more firmly what we feel than what we think. Quite early in the PhD project, in a room in Paisley Cathedral, just outside of Glasgow, I told Romans 16 for the participants of a worship society workshop. At this point, I was still using the NRSV translation. And so I spoke the word greet over and over again in that performance. And my body reached out. My body reached out. As if towards the people that Paul and Phoebe would have the listeners greet. Reaching towards them. Reaching across significant barriers that they'd erected between each other, these members and different households within the broader church in Rome. And greet suddenly seemed an inadequate word for the action that was required. Greet, in our use of English today, felt to me to have something either formal or almost perfunctory about it. It's as if by saying greet, Mary, greet Philologus, Paul was saying, say hi to them for me. And the more I inhabited the letter and this chapter at its conclusion, the more that greet or say hi felt inadequate. It felt like that wasn't matching the gesture that my body was intuitively making. Look at it. It's one half of a hug. It's a cupping of the face. It's a reaching towards, drawing you into my space, asking you to draw me into your space. Was my body misinterpreting? Or was it pointing to an inadequate interpretation in that translation of the Greek into the English we speak today? Interpreters have particularly parts of chapter 15 where Paul's talking about the Spanish mission that's coming up as very important and very much about Paul. So then they link all of those greetings, all the times he says, say hi, to that mission. And they're saying it's about Paul establishing himself and wanting to draw people into his mission. But I don't know. It's one small part of a very big letter. I'd even feel in my sinews and bones that Paul was primarily saying, hi, Mary. I mean, as he names the people, he does point to all of those connections that he has within the church in Rome. And that does establish a foundation on which the people can trust him and trust Phoebe as his representative. But by the time I get to Romans 16 in performance, I have spoken chapters 1 to 8 and the wrestling with difference and division between Jew and Gentile, between Torah observing and non-Torah observing followers of Christ. I've spoken his various exhortations to make space for one another with their differences in chapters 12 to 15, to welcome one another in love. And I've been in Paul's place, reaching out to the Roman members of the church, seeking to help them reach across the divide to each other. Say hi to them for me. It's not what my body is saying as it reaches towards Mary. Half a hug, a cupping of a face. The word is aspasis there. That's the word they translate as greet most often. But for me, it seemed more to be saying embrace. Ben Witherington is one who agrees with that translation. Aspasis there is a welcoming into your embrace that the whole letter is building towards, step by step. It's a welcome into embrace that our baptism into one spirit evokes and enacts, a welcome of each other as we are, for that is how we need each other in healthy community. That's what aspasis there is saying when Romans 16 is performed at the close of a performance of the letter. I found my way to that understanding of Romans 16, of aspasis there, and of the letter as a whole by standing before an audience, speaking greet, and having my body say more. Having my body show me that the letter was saying more. The body knows. The process of using the body as a tool in interpretation is to prepare and rehearse and speak the words aloud, observing our body's intuitive movements and interrogating them for what they're showing us the Bible and the Spirit is saying. It's about paying attention to it. It will show us something of our own self or something in the composition. Our task is to interrogate what our movements are doing. Is it saying something about me or the composition? What do I keep from this movement which will speak helpfully as I mediate and interpret this composition for my audience? So that's what we're doing when we're using the body as a tool for interpretation. Emotion's quite similar in its process. Now, emotion, affect, feelings, passions, humours, moods. Those are just the various names that are given to what I'm naming for simplicity, emotion. The language around emotion is further problematised post-Enlightenment, when scholars in almost every field, it seems, forgot that this affective element of human experience is intrinsic to human being. It's a vital tool in our interpretation of the world, vital for negotiating society and for human survival. And I say more about this in the book. When I use emotion, then, I'm referring to our affective feelings, which we experience with our physical or physiological and cognitive receptors. It's a very whole person thing. So as a tool, what I'm doing is attending to what I'm feeling, and again, I'm determining whether the feelings are telling me something about me or about the composition I'm performing. And I integrate learning from historical and literary approaches to make choices for what the Bible is becoming for this embodied performance of it. When I was preparing Romans for performance interpretation, I had quite a strong emotional response to chapters 9 to 11. On the one hand, as I got inside Paul's argument, it helped me to see with his eyes and feel with his feelings, his reaching for understanding, as he reorganised his ideas about the relationship of Holy One with their holy people. But on the other hand, I felt such a weight of generations of anti-Jewish sentiment and violence, generations of Christian arrogance towards our Jewish kin and towards those of any faith or none other than our own, when we claim that this revelation of the divine in Christ is the definitive or the only path into reconciled relationship with Holy One. The community I was preparing the performance for, the ultimate final performance, was the congregation that I had candidated from and that my family belonged to. I know them very well. And I know that they share, many of them share with me a commitment to understanding that those whose spirituality and philosophy may differ from ours, but is evidently life-giving and spreads peace and seeks justice and encourages love, is to be affirmed and celebrated, not denigrated. We try and leave all of that up to God. So my emotional response told me I could not speak those words to this audience. I couldn't speak them. Remember what I said about embodied performance interpretation being personal and particular? This approach takes seriously the particular person who is mediating the composition in any given moment. In written commentaries, we're lucky to get a note with a nod to bias. On my particular voice and my particular body, a composition will say something particular. So as a person known to be affirming of other faiths, I couldn't speak these words for performance with the weight of the baggage they carry. Not without engaging in conversation, not without hearing the stories of the oppressed, not without telling the story of our complicity in that oppression and violence. And that wasn't what I was doing in this performance. This performance was standalone. How can the Bible speak as it is on its own, mediated in the person of the performer? So how much can we say in our bodies? An important question for interpretation and the form of our performance interpretation or any interpretation, how that biblical portion is to be received, is will I include comment within the performance? as a breaking out with asides, or alongside it as a sermon or a lecture or a conversation with the audience, or not at all. And if you're not having any conversation at all, the question becomes, how much can my body say by way of comment and interpretation and acknowledgement of the problematic nature of certain parts of the Bible for audiences today? So what I was doing here was allowing myself to feel in rehearsal what I felt intuitively and instinctively. The distaste, the shame, the desire to spit out these words from having been on my voice at all. Honestly, it felt as abhorrent as that. Then I had to step back and interrogate and examine those feelings. Was I finding Paul's words in and of themselves distasteful? And why? Was I finding the history of reception of those words distasteful? How has it been received and interpreted over time? Was my sense of revulsion and wanting to spit the words out telling me something only about me? Or was it also reflecting something of the audience I was holding in my mind, that I couldn't speak them for them? Can I find a way to deepen my understanding through other interpretive methods and the insights of other scholars? And can I find a way to give voice to these words for my audience using embodied performance only and convey meaning for this audience? So it's a very integrated process and approach within itself. All of those tools really meld across into each other. Emotion and audience are working together well here. But also it's integrated with other methods of interpretation. So I mentioned reception history, or we might think about it as the history of consequences, which for these chapters seemed to require a different mode of reception and interpretation for my audience. It needed more conversation around it. They couldn't just stand alone on my voice. For such questions, we might also engage with rhetorical or socio-historical interpretations. And almost every biblical performance scholar you read or talk with will note how interdisciplinary this approach is, however you're applying it. At least within the field of biblical studies, but also with other fields, in particular performance studies within sociology, psychology, drama and theatre studies. Emotion as a tool for interpretation is about paying attention to what I, as the performer, am feeling as I inhabit and internalise the composition, as I invite it to affect me and attend to that impact. By identifying and examining our feelings, our particular feelings in response to the composition, we do several things. So we allow our emotion to show us meaning, which it does. We allow our own story some space to butt up against the Bible, and we can find meaning there, possibly only for ourselves, but possibly for our audience as well. And in doing that, it allows us time to process our own story and do that discerning work of, is it telling something about me or about the composition? And it gives us time to get out of the way so that we can mediate the story meaningfully for our audience. There's a tension in this approach between acknowledging the personal and particular body and person and voice on which the composition is mediated, and going too far and turning it into a story about me. So in preparation, we're trying to feel the emotions that might be about us, not the composition, and then put them to the side. And so that we can leave space for the audience to feel their own responses and do their interpretive work as they receive the composition in performance. And so why don't we talk a bit more about the audience? A live audience can be understood as participants in rather than recipients of a performance. From theatre studies, we learn that the audience, with their presence and attention and responses and energy, as well as their discovering and making meaning for themselves, the audience are co-creators in the performance moment as much as the performers, the directors, the creative and technical teams. So that's theatre studies. Social scientists see humans as always performer and always audience in our everyday lives. The world is a literal stage for human players. Shakespeare, the early social scientist. Now, if you know me, you knew I was going to get Shakespeare in here somewhere. But actually, performers of Shakespeare are often interviewed for the Royal Shakespeare Company in the Globe, and there's this library of audio and video interviews with actors. And they provide insight from the perspective of the performer into the ways that their interpretation of a character is incomplete until they bring it to an audience and receive the energy and response that completes for them an understanding of, well, who is this character in this embodied performance, in this production of the play? So for my project, I drew bounds around what I understood an audience to be. Rather than the social scientist's view of every encounter as performance for audience, for me, I'm talking about audience as those who are gathered for a particular performance of a biblical passage in a particular time and place. The audience acts as an interpretive tool in two ways. So you've got the imagination of the performer-interpreter while you're preparing the text, and you're holding them, you're envisaging them as you're rehearsing and anticipating what their responses might be from what you know of this particular audience. And also in the performance moment as you interact together in that space when you make the story or the letter or the prophecy come alive between you. So you're holding the people in your mind. What will these words, what will this passage mean for these people today? So we began at the end of the letter of the Romans. We skipped over the middle, and now I'm going to come to an example from chapter 1. Another part of the letter that I struggled with, but I left it in for the performance, was Romans 1, 26 to 27. I struggled with how to say these lines meaningfully and not harmfully for 21st century audiences, many of whom would include LGBTQI folk who have experienced the church's harmful judgment of their identity, who have been vilified, condemned and excluded, using such passages as Romans 1 as justification for those actions. As we prepare biblical proportions for telling to be received by listeners today, those listeners do shape our interpretation of the Bible. They determine its mode and form of reception. They tell us how to tell the story today. We've seen over time painters choosing to put characters in medieval clothing or under a tree in a desert to cast light on the face of a younger brother or leave the older in shadow, to include the otherwise absent mother in a depiction of a particular parable. Painters choose how they're telling the story for their audience. And it's generally shaped by their audience. All those medieval paintings that put the biblical characters into that time and place, when we know they're not European. So it's the same is true as we experiment with tone and pause, expression, gesture, posture, translation. We're holding our audience in mind because we're seeking to communicate with these particular people on this particular occasion, to invite them to discover meaning in these stories that shape our Christian discipleship. To know that when we tell a story of outsiders, like Ruth perhaps, When our leaders are making policy to marginalise, demonise and further exclude from our nation's care the outsiders who are seeking refuge from their war-torn countries, shapes our expression of voice and face as an invitation for connection and compassion among our audiences, or not. The first time I performed Romans, the first part of Romans, for an audience, I fumbled the words of 1:26-27. I thought I had got to a place where I could speak them clearly, but I couldn't when I got there. But my audience fed back to me that they received that fumbling as an interpretation. For them, that fumbling conveyed the reality that reception of these words today is problematic for us. But I wanted to push further with translating the Greek, understanding the first century culture and the years of reception of that passage. I wanted to feel the verses within the context of the broader argument that surrounds them. I wanted to keep trying every way I could to uncover a Paul who was not anti-LGBTQI if he was there. So I tried a different kind of performance interpretation with the help of Jason Chestnut.
Whenever you're ready.
Okay. From the creation of the world, the eternal power and divine nature of Creator, though invisible, have been understood and seen through the things Creator has made. Therefore, we have no excuse, for though we knew Holy One, we did not acknowledge them as Holy One. We became futile in our thinking. Our senseless minds were darkened. We exchanged the glory of the immortal Holy One for images of mortal human beings, or birds, or four-footed animals, or reptiles. Therefore, Holy One gave us up in the lusts of our hearts to impurity, to the dishonouring of our bodies among ourselves, because we exchanged the truth of Holy One for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature, not the Creator. For this reason, Holy One gave us up to endured dishonour. Women exchanged natural relations for unnatural. Men and women exchanged natural relations for unnatural, became consumed with passion for one another. Men conquered men shamelessly. We endured the penalties of our actions in our own persons. Since we did not acknowledge Holy One, Holy One gave us up to a debased mind, to things that ought not be done. We were filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, covetousness, malice. We were full of envy, murder, strife, craftiness, deceit. We were slanderers, gossipers, Holy One haters, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, rebellious towards parents, senseless. We were without loyalty, without kindness, without loyalty, without mercy.
I'm convinced that the broader portion in Romans 1 to 2 is concerned with a breadth of ways that humanity, Jew and Gentile, are seen by Paul to have fallen short of Holy One's way. I'm less certain that Paul holds up the example of same-gender sexual immorality as an example of an imbalance of power rather than undesirable intimate relationships, which I tried to see. I've stretched the interpretation to its limits, and ultimately it does feel stretched. I couldn't make Paul say anything other than, this is wrong. So when we receive these verses today, we need to do so with care. And we need to do so with comment and contextualization and with apology for the harm to which it has been put when we receive this portion today. Not, as I did, receive it and let it stand on its own. Embodied performance analysis is not without its limits, especially when we come to performance interpretation and reception. There are portions that are problematic enough that we can't say enough between the words to make it meaningful in reception for our audience today. The point of this method, embodied performance analysis, is that how we tell the story is not simply about communicating an interpretation of the story. How we're telling the story is itself interpreting the story. So I hope we've seen that our bodies know intuitively, physically, and deeply. I encourage us to pay attention. When we feel we are expressing knowledge and understanding and meaning, so pay attention. The stories of our time and community meet the biblical compositions, and in their conversation, there is meaning to discover about each. To pay attention. Embodied performance analysis ultimately is about paying attention to the holistic ways in which humans make meaning every day, and therefore are making meaning when we engage with the Bible. God's incarnation in Jesus, the stories and psalms that tell of creation, all of this affirms our embodied nature, our wholeness as good. So bring it all to your work of telling God's story. Use it all and pay attention. This approach doesn't replace other modes of interpretation, it engages with them. It's inherently interdisciplinary, and it enhances our engagement and encounter and interpretation of the Bible. As I mentioned earlier, a performance interpretation might be a live telling, it could be a digital telling, it could be a drama. Use your imaginations. And the critical reflection can articulate the process behind the performance and illuminate the ways in which the performance has interpreted the Bible. Through our preparation and our performance and our reflection. So I've shown you some of the examples from my interpretation of Romans. But I wonder if a more integrated embodied performance analysis of a short passage might further demonstrate this method. And I'm going to do that with Micah 6, 1-8, which is one of our focus portions for the festival gathering. Don't forget that you can discover more about embodied performance analysis and about how we as humans know through our bodies and emotions and make meaning relationally in the book, which is coming out soon. So Micah 6, 1-8. Hear, I pray, what breath of life says. Arise, plead your case before the mountains. Let the hills hear your voice. Here, mountains and perpetual foundations of earth, the case of breath of life. Breath of life has a case against their people, and with Israel they will argue. My people, what have I done to you? How have I worn you down? Answer me. I have brought you up from the land of Egypt, from the house of slaves. I redeemed you. I sent before you Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. My people, remember, I pray, what Balak, king of Moab, advised, and how Balaam, son of Beor, answered him from Shittim to Gilgal. Remember, in order to know the just acts of breath of life. With what shall I meet breath of life? Will I prostrate myself before Holy One on high? Will I meet breath of life with sucklings, with calves, young ones of a year? Will breath of life be pleased with thousands of rams, with overflowing torrents of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgressions, the fruit of my body, sin of my being? They have declared to you, human, what is good, what breath of life is seeking from you. Only to do justice, to love loving kindness, to make attentive your walk with your Holy One. So for our critical reflection, I'm going to start with the audience. You don't have to start with body, even though that's what I introduced with the tools first. Audience as a tool for interpretation influences the choices of language and translation as I consider how this group of people will hear and be able to understand the portion. So first I want to consider divine names and how I translated them. I translated breath of life for Adonai, the holy name. We translate Adonai as the Lord. My translation is an experiment, and it's inspired by the written but unsounded Hebrew, which if we wrote that in English would be YHWH, an acronym of the holy name. If vocalized, the two sounds of Yah, might be the sound of breathing in and breathing out. You could try it. Yah, signifying the divine as the very breath of life and defying a name at all. I use they and their, the non-gendered pronoun for the divine. And for a Christian audience, the plural nature of that might also call into our mind the understanding of the Holy Trinity as a plural, as well as being one. A couple of times I think we have the Hebrew uses El for God, and I use Holy One, where most English translations would say God. Again, that's experimenting with different ways of using language. The next thing to consider when I was thinking about the audience is the word plays and oral links. The repeated Hebrew word, rib, occurs 3 times in this passage. But most translations translate it differently. So the first time it's there, it's a verb, and the second 2 times it's a noun. And usually for the verb, they will use plead your case. But then they use controversy the second 2 times. But I have used case all 3 times. Now, I think it's really important, as much as possible, to use the same word or word group in English when the Hebrew does so, because the composers in the Hebrew, or if you're using a Greek passage, have made choices for listeners, written compositions in the time that these were originating, were created and composed with the expectation that they'd be heard aloud. So language is very much about how it impacts a listener, and its impact on the listener orally enhances or gives layers of meaning. So I try, and you're trying to not only translate semantic meaning of the words, but the meaningful impact of the language when it's heard. There's a play on words in the Hebrew with la'ah and al'ah. So others will say wearied you for the first of those, but I say worn you down. How have I worn you down? So this does 2 things. It contrasts with up. I brought you up from Egypt. So you've got the contrasts there. And then there's a subtle rhyme with worn and brought. How have I worn you down? How have I brought you up? Or I have brought you up. Now, I can hear that rhyme in my Australian accent, but I will acknowledge that that might be different in other accents. So that will also come into it, is our accent with our language. The NRSV has the divine saying righteous acts. That's the NIV, sorry, and the NRSV says saving. But I say just acts, the just acts of breath of life, which makes a linguistic link for the listener between this divine character and the call of the divine to do justice in scene 2. Another thing to consider is cultural capital for our audiences. What does the composition assume its audience will know or call to mind, which is no longer the case? We can't make that assumption of our audience today. So it's quite unusual to have Miriam listed with her brothers as an apparent equal partner in the redemption of the Israelites. We could, especially if we were using a feminist approach to the Bible, this portion, we could put a vocal emphasis on Miriam, Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. But I think actually that undermines what this inclusion of Miriam actually does, which is to afford her equality with Moses and Aaron. So I try very hard to speak all 3 names with equal weight, and therefore not to detract from the way that she's named as an equal. Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, 3 together. I've added a repetition of remember at the end of scene 1. It only occurs once in the Hebrew. This is another way of bridging the gap a bit with cultural capital. The composer of this portion will assume that the people will be able to remember the story of Balak and Balaam. But I can't assume that of audiences today, no matter how well you're versed in the Bible. So I thought about what the divine is doing. They're calling the people to remember their stories so as to enter the stories of justice through history, of divine justice through history. And it's to justice that the people are being called in scene 2. So in some ways I might be making different oral links or different cultural links by linking the justice there in scene 1 with scene 2, but also by repeating remember, I'm drawing attention to the act of remembering rather than which story to remember. because we will remember different stories of divine justice through history. So it's translating the sense of it, not the necessarily the specific detail of it. Considering how the body interprets this passage, a couple of things. As I embody the words of the human in their sort of response to the case that Breath of Life has, I have in mind a picture of the human with arms outstretched, really bearing gifts as if to placate Breath of Life to try and bring about a change of mind. Interpreters like Mays make a similar observation. There's some subtleties in posture and voice for each character, and there's the repeated gesture of sort of holding my hand up for the prophet, sort of calling the people to remember and to listen. It's a bit difficult with this small screen for you to see that perhaps. And the emotions in interpreting this portion. In performance, I feel and express the growing emotions of desperation in scene 2. The human is realising there is nothing that we can do to cover transgressions. There's a pause before the final lines of the prophet. I felt only silence could really convey the impact, to allow the human desperation to hang in the air, so you can really feel the weight of that. Holding my posture before I changed demeanour to the calm and pointed posture of the prophet allows also for an emotional shift through the silence, from the desperation to the calm and poignant reminder of what the human ought to know but has forgotten. And there's a weight to only. It's as simple and profound as only giving our life and being over to the way of Breath of Life. Because it's so simple and so profound, I speak it slowly, with space before and space after, and again it sort of allows for the emotional impact and weight of that. I also want to draw attention to something of the personal and particular nature of embodied performance interpretation that I've mentioned a couple of times. This is an example of where you can see the impact of me as interpreter and performer on the composition. The NIV translates and says land of slavery. NRSV says house of slavery. And I say house of slaves. It's a more literal translation of the Hebrew. Now, for those who are translating the plural slaves as slavery, that may indeed be a meaning you can draw of that. But I quite like the poetry of house of slaves. And also it occurred to me that if this is a question of identity rather than of state, so the state of slavery, Breath of Life has redeemed Israel from their identity as slaves and restored them to their identity as my people. It's much more well embodied and whole about the person rather than about the state and the context in which they're in. Which then implies that when the human asks, what can I do? Actually, it's the wrong question. Who are you called to be is the better question that draws us back into our full life-giving identity. The only thing you can do, the prophet seems to say, is remember who you are. You are holy ones, called people, shaped by divine nature, which is justice, loving kindness, and presence. In the next 2 sessions, we're going to consider how our bodies, emotions, and relationality, the fullness of our being, is engaged when we encounter the biblical stories in worship and devotion, and then in our personal stories. So I'll see you in session 2. For now, I'm going to conclude with a prayer, which comes from my other website, Pray the Story. And it's inspired by Micah 6, 1-8. With what shall I come before the Lord? With a shopping list of wants and needs, promises and bargains to buy God's favour? With what shall I come before the Lord? With piety professed and on display, shows of affection for the last, then retreat into comfort to wash my hands. With what shall I come before the Lord? With guilty admissions of sins and scandals, unable to forgive myself and others, and so not believing God will truly forgive. God has told you, human one, what is good and right and perfect. What does God require of you? Live justly, in relationships of mutual respect and honour. Love with kindness, in relationships of mutual care and encouragement. Walk humbly with your God, created creature much beloved, giving love and honour to the Holy One. Know that you are indeed forgiven your turning from what is good and right and perfect, and live once more in the grace of God, who is good and right and perfect. Amen.